It was March 1944. The date doesn't matter as much as what happened that day. What happened was that American fighters, P-51 Mustangs, long-range escort fighters that nobody had thought could exist, showed up over Berlin. Over Berlin. Over the capital city of the Reich, where German fighters were supposed to have absolute air superiority. Von Webern was flying a Messerschmitt 109G that day at 31,000 feet when he saw them. Not one or two, dozens, maybe more. They were above the American bomber stream providing top cover, and they were moving with the kind of discipline and coordination that German fighters hadn't seen from American pilots before. He'd been flying fighters for the Luftwaffe since 1939. He'd seen Poland fall. He'd seen France collapse in 6 weeks. He'd seen the Battle of Britain. He'd fought over Russia, where the skies belonged to whoever had the most fighters. And he'd survived all of it because he was a good pilot and because he understood the fundamental rules of air warfare: altitude advantage, sun advantage, surprise, and speed. These were the rules that German pilots lived by. But the P-51 Mustang had changed the rules. Von Webern wasn't an ace yet. He had 14 confirmed kills, which was respectable but not exceptional. His wingman, Lieutenant Reichmann, had 8 kills and was a solid pilot, not brilliant but reliable. They were part of Jagdgeschwader 54, the Greenhearts, flying out of Golnau and protecting the Reich's airspace from the increasing bomber offensive. For most of 1943, this job had been manageable. The American bombers, B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators, were formidable aircraft with heavy defensive armament, but they were slow and they couldn't fight. The German fighters would get above them and dive through the bomber formation, firing as they passed. Bombers would fall, the fighters would climb back up and make another attack. It was called the Polk-Zerstörung tactic, polk destruction. Wave after wave of German fighters, each one making a single attack pass, then climbing back up to attack again. Against unescorted bombers, this tactic was brutally effective. Bomber losses ran between 5 and 10% per mission, which was unsustainable for the Americans. Berlin had assured the Luftwaffe that this situation would continue indefinitely. American bombers would come in waves, and German fighters would destroy them. The Americans didn't have a fighter with the range to escort bombers all the way to Germany. The Americans couldn't build a fighter that could both carry enough fuel for long range and maintain the performance necessary to fight German fighters. The Americans couldn't do it because nobody could do it. It was impossible. Until it wasn't. The P-51 Mustang had started out as a British-ordered fighter aircraft that didn't meet British specifications. The Americans had taken the design, upgraded the engine to a Merlin V12 built under license by Packard, and suddenly had a fighter that could match or exceed German fighters at every altitude while carrying enough fuel to escort bombers from England to Berlin and back. Von Webern learned about the P-51 Mustang the way most German pilots learned about new American equipment, by encountering it in combat and nearly dying in the process. His diary entry for March 6, 1944 reads, "Intercepted American bomber stream at 0930 hours near Berlin. Heavy concentrations of B-17s, estimated 300-plus aircraft with fighter escort at high altitude. Attempted standard attack profile, climbing to position above and ahead of the bomber stream. At 32,000 feet, encountered single American fighter at 33,000 feet. Did not recognize type initially. American aircraft is smaller than expected, single engine mounted what appears to be Merlin type engine. Aircraft handles well at altitude, better than our 109G at this height. Made diving attack. American pilot broke hard into turn, which should have resulted in fatal overspeed or snap roll. Aircraft performed neither. Continued into hard horizontal turn at extreme angle of bank. Fired short burst, believe no hits. American aircraft turned inside our turning radius at altitude. This should not be possible. Broke combat and climbed away. American aircraft did not pursue, but returned to bomber stream at high altitude. Reichmann did not see engagement. Estimated American fighter performance is significantly higher than initial reports." That was the beginning. The first time a German pilot encountered the P-51 Mustang and lived to write about it. Within days, similar reports were coming in from pilots across the Reich. The American fighters were faster at altitude. They climbed better than expected. They turned better than expected. They had range nobody thought possible. And they were showing up over cities that the Luftwaffe had considered safe from fighter escort: Marienburg, Regensburg, Stuttgart, Munich, and finally, inexplicably, Berlin itself. Von Webern made a point of researching the aircraft. Through informal channels, other pilots, intelligence briefings, rumors from Berlin, he assembled a picture of what the Americans had built. The P-51 Mustang had a combat radius of roughly 1,300 kilometers with external fuel tanks. That meant it could fly from England to anywhere in Germany and back. It cruised at 640 kilometers per hour. It could climb at over 1,000 meters per minute. It was armed with 6.50 caliber machine guns, and most importantly, it was being produced in numbers that were staggering. By April 1944, the Luftwaffe estimated that over 2,000 P-51s had been delivered to the American 8th Air Force. That number would double, then triple over the following months. The P-51 wasn't a new fighter. It was the beginning of the end. Von Webern understood this because he was a trained observer. He noted the patterns, he tracked the escalation, he understood the mathematics. For every P-51 that was shot down by German fighters, another one arrived from America. For every German fighter that was lost, the Luftwaffe had to replace it with a pilot who had received less training than the one who died. American pilots rotated home after 25 or 50 missions, depending on the year. They returned home experienced. German fighters flew until they were killed. The diary entries from April and May 1944 show a man beginning to confront reality. April 11th. Encountered P-51 escort fighters when attacking B-17 formation. Made climbing attack to gain altitude advantage. P-51s did not attempt to maintain formation with bombers, but instead attacked from above. Our conventional tactics of maintaining altitude advantage do not work against this aircraft. Pilot training must have emphasized high-altitude performance. German fighters cannot compete in these conditions. Lost Feldfebel Hartmann to P-51 gunfire. He was a good pilot with 6 kills. He will not be easily replaced. April 23rd. Received intelligence briefing on American fighter production. 8th Air Force has received approximately 3,000 P-51s to date. Production continues at rate of 300-plus aircraft per month. American pilot training pipeline is producing 5,000 pilots per month. And German pilot training pipeline is producing 1,200 pilots per month, and this number is decreasing due to fuel shortages affecting training operations. Mathematical analysis. At current replacement rates, American fighter force will achieve overwhelming numerical superiority by late 1944. German fighter force will be unable to replace losses. Strategic conclusion. Germany cannot win air war over Reich.
May 8th. Attacked American bomber formation with 4 Bf-109s. P-51 escort fighters immediately engaged. Engaged P-51 piloted by American captain with apparent experience. Aircraft handling excellent. Pilot very skilled. Broke away from engagement and returned to base. 2 Bf-109s failed to return. Reichman claims 1 confirmed kill on transport aircraft, but admits that bomber escort prevented deeper penetration of formation. Debriefing officer from Berlin says we must increase aggression and accept higher losses to continue air defense mission. Politically correct response. Tactically suicidal. The frustration in the diary entries becomes more apparent as the months pass. Von Webern was seeing the situation clearly, but he was increasingly isolated in that clarity. Berlin was still issuing orders to maintain air superiority. Division command was still demanding high pilot morale, and pilots were still dying at increasing rates. By June 1944, in the immediate aftermath of the D-Day landings, German fighter aviation was in crisis. The Luftwaffe was trying to defend France against invasion, defend the Reich against bombing, and maintain training operations with a shrinking pool of experienced pilots and increasingly obsolete aircraft. The Bf-109 had been an excellent fighter in 1940. By 1944, it was beginning to show its age. The aircraft had been stretched to accommodate more powerful engines. The fuselage was becoming overloaded. Performance was degrading. And against the P-51 Mustang, the Bf-109G was consistently outperformed in any engagement that wasn't started from a position of overwhelming altitude advantage. Von Webern's solution was to advocate for better training, better tactics, and better understanding of the new threat. His superior solution was to keep attacking. June 1944 was the moment when German fighter aviation transitioned from difficult to impossible. With the D-Day invasion, the Luftwaffe was forced to scatter its fighters across multiple fronts. Some were defending the invasion beaches, some were defending German airspace, some were trying to provide tactical air support for ground forces. The result was that nowhere did the Luftwaffe have numerical superiority. Everywhere, the Allies had more fighters. Von Webern was moved to Abbeville in northern France to provide fighter defense for the invasion front. His unit, now redesignated as Jagdgruppe 1 of JG-54, consisted of approximately 30 Bf-109s and 30 FW-190s. The unit was tasked with conducting daily missions over the invasion zone. The American fighter strength in this sector was approximately 200 P-51 Mustangs and another 200 fighters of various types, including P-47 Thunderbolts, Spitfires, and Tempests. When you did the math, the situation was mathematically hopeless. But mathematically hopeless situations are still fought by real pilots, so von Webern and his men flew. His diary from June 15th reads, "Escorted Ju-87 Stukas on ground support mission over the invasion zone. Intended target was British landing craft concentrations near Gold Beach. Encountered P-51 escort fighters approximately 20 kilometers inland. Attempted to position for diving attack on bombers. American fighters immediately engaged. Fight developed over the landing zone at approximately 10,000 feet. Visibility was good. American fighters showed clear numerical advantage. 6 P-51s against our 4 Bf-109s. American pilots flew in loose formation using energy management to maintain altitude advantage. Standard German Rote tactics appeared ineffective. American fighters demonstrated superior turn radius at 10,000 feet altitude. Broke away from combat after one pilot was hit and headed for friendly territory. Estimated he reached Dieppe before ditching. Ground fire from British positions prevented recovery of the pilot. Stukas were engaged by British flak and forced to abort bomb run. Mission result, complete failure. Pilot lost, Lieutenant Erwin Schaefer. Good pilot, 5 confirmed kills. Replacement will arrive from training unit with approximately 100 hours of combat experience." The tone of despair in these entries increases through June and July. Each mission followed a similar pattern. German fighters would attempt to intercept bombers or provide ground support. American fighters would engage and force them away from their targets. Losses would occur, no permanent effect would be achieved. By late June, von Webern had been promoted to Hauptmann and given command of his Staffel, approximately 12 fighter pilots, and he was also accumulating kills. By mid-July, he had 23 confirmed kills, which made him an ace and gave him a certain authority in the fighter community. But authority couldn't change the fundamental reality that Germany was losing pilots faster than it could train them, and every pilot lost represented not just the casualty, but a loss of experience that couldn't be replaced. July 5th diary entry. Our unit has flown 47 combat missions in June. Results: 9 confirmed kills, 6 probable kills, 6 damaged American aircraft. Friendly losses: 18 fighters destroyed, 9 damaged beyond immediate repair. Pilot losses: 14 killed, 3 captured. Replacement pilots arriving from training units are showing extremely poor training standards. Some have never fired their guns except on the ground. Some have never flown at altitude above 8,000 meters. Some have never engaged in aerial combat. These pilots are being sent to die. I have written multiple reports to Division Command outlining the training deficiency. Each report has been rejected. Berlin's position remains that pilot training should be shortened to get replacement pilots to combat units faster. This policy ensures a constant supply of inexperienced pilots to replace experienced ones who are killed. The mathematics of this system guarantee eventual defeat. We are not losing air superiority because of some failure of the Luftwaffe. We are losing it because America can produce fighters faster than we can shoot them down and train pilots faster than we can kill them. This is not a tactical problem. It is an industrial problem, and it cannot be solved with better tactics or greater aggression. By August, the situation had deteriorated further. The Luftwaffe was barely conducting offensive operations anymore. Instead, it was trying to maintain a defensive screen against the overwhelming weight of American air power. The P-51 Mustangs had proven that they could fight German fighters and win. The P-47 Thunderbolts had proven that they could carry bombs and rockets and perform close air support while maintaining air superiority. The British Spitfires had proven they could operate effectively in the tactical theater. Against this, the Luftwaffe had approximately 1,200 fighters operational on all fronts in August 1944. The Allies had approximately 5,000 fighters operational over Europe. When you did the math, the outcome was no longer in question. Von Webern's unit was pulled back to German airspace. The defensive battle for France had been lost. Now the battle was over German territory.
September through November 1944 was the period when German fighter aviation made its final stand. The Luftwaffe was no longer trying to achieve air superiority. It was trying to survive. The daily bomber raids on German industry, German cities, and German transportation infrastructure were relentless. B-17s and B-24s arrived in waves of hundreds, always escorted by fighters that had the performance, the training, and the numerical advantage to defeat German interceptors. Tactically, German pilots were still excellent. Operationally, German units were still conducting complex missions. Strategically, the situation was completely hopeless. Von Webern's diary from September 1944 shows a man trying to maintain professionalism in an increasingly impossible situation. Received orders from division to increase pilot training and combat effectiveness. Orders acknowledge previous reports about pilot training deficiency. Response: all combat units are to receive dedicated training periods where half the unit maintains combat readiness while the other half conducts training. In practice, this means we have fewer fighters available for combat missions while training new pilots who will be dead within 10 missions anyway. The solution is politically acceptable but tactically nonsensical. Our current pilot roster consists of 8 experienced pilots with over 100 combat missions each, 4 pilots with 20 to 40 missions, and 3 new arrivals with less than 10 missions each. The 3 new pilots have already been assigned to combat missions because we lack the resources to train them properly. One was killed today. Another was captured. The third is in hospital with burns. Average pilot survival rate is approximately 15 missions before the pilot is either killed, captured, or rotated out of combat. American pilots, by contrast, complete their tours of duty and rotate home. They leave the theater with 50 or more missions completed. These veteran pilots train new American pilots. This creates a constantly improving force. Our system creates a constantly declining force. October brought the first large-scale German defensive operations using the new Me-262 jet fighter. The Me-262 was revolutionary. It could fly at 870 kilometers per hour, making it faster than any conventional fighter in combat. However, the aircraft had serious limitations. It was expensive to produce, it was complex to maintain, and it consumed fuel at a frightening rate. Most importantly, there were barely 100 of them operational in October 1944. Against the thousands of conventional fighters the Allies had available, the Me-262 represented an interesting technological development, but not a solution to Germany's strategic air problem. Von Webern encountered a Me-262 during a mission over Munich on October 19, 1944. His diary entry describes the meeting. Witnessed engagement between Me-262 and P-51 Mustang over Munich. The jet demonstrated clear speed advantage in level flight.
American pilot appeared to recognize the aircraft's characteristics and avoided engagement in horizontal plane. Instead, American pilot attempted to force the Me-262 into a turn at altitude above 8,000 meters. Me-262 pilot broke off engagement rather than accept turning fight. Me-262 conducted low-altitude pass on bomber formation, but was unable to make weapon pass due to American fighter escort. Returned to Augsburg Airfield at high speed. Assessment: Me-262 represents significant technological achievement. However, aircraft's operational limitations make it unsuitable for current tactical situation. Aircraft requires special fuel. Aircraft requires specialized maintenance. Aircraft's speed advantage is negated by its poor acceleration and turning characteristics at combat speeds. Most critically, there are not enough Me-262s to affect the overall air war situation. Production rate is approximately 50 aircraft per month. American fighter production rate is approximately 1,000 aircraft per month. Mathematics remain unchanged. Germany cannot win. By November 1944, German fighter aviation was conducting what could only be described as suicide missions. Pilots were being ordered to ram enemy aircraft if they couldn't shoot them down. Units were being equipped with aircraft that were barely combat capable. Training standards had been eliminated in favor of getting pilots to combat as quickly as possible. On November 27, 1944, Operation Bodenplatte was launched. This was Germany's last major offensive operation, a surprise attack on Allied airfields in Belgium, the Netherlands, and France, intended to destroy Allied aircraft on the ground and restore some measure of German air superiority. Von Webern participated. His Staffel was tasked with attacking an American airfield near Brussels. The plan was simple: fly low to avoid detection, arrive at dawn, and strafe the parked aircraft. In theory, it was a brilliant plan. In practice, it was a disaster. The American airfields had been warned of the attack through intelligence sources. Fighter patrols were maintained throughout the night. When the German formations appeared, they were met with overwhelming opposition. The operation achieved some success. Over 300 Allied aircraft were destroyed on the ground. But the Luftwaffe lost over 700 fighters, including over 200 pilots killed. Most of those pilots were experienced or semi-experienced. Most of them couldn't be replaced. Von Webern's unit suffered 60% casualties. 5 of his 12 pilots were killed. 2 were captured. 3 were wounded. 1 aircraft was completely destroyed. Another 3 were severely damaged. For the loss of 9 fighters and 3 experienced pilots, the Staffel accounted for 4 confirmed American aircraft destroyed on the ground. Von Webern's diary entry from November 27th is among the longest in the entire document. Operation Bodenplatte was a catastrophe. Yes, we destroyed American aircraft. Yes, we achieved tactical surprise, but the cost was unsustainable. The Luftwaffe lost approximately 220 experienced pilots today. These pilots cannot be replaced. The American 8th Air Force will receive replacement aircraft within a week. The American training pipeline will receive replacement pilots within 2 months. The Luftwaffe will be lucky to have replacement pilots available within 6 months. I have lost 8 pilots since August 1st. My unit began August with 20 pilots. We now have 12 pilots available for operations, and half of those have received less than 50 hours of combat training. The average American fighter pilot in the theater has completed at least 100 hours of combat missions. Our aircraft are becoming increasingly obsolete. Our fuel situation is becoming increasingly critical. Our pilot training pipeline is collapsing due to fuel shortages and the loss of training airfields to the advancing Allies. Our production is being disrupted by constant bombing. Our logistics are being disrupted by attacks on rail lines and ports. Meanwhile, the Americans continue to produce fighters at unsustainable rates, train pilots in quantities we cannot match, and maintain air superiority over every sector of the theater. They can afford to lose pilots and aircraft. We cannot. I have formally requested transfer to a different position. My request has been denied. I will continue to fly combat missions and watch my pilots die while Berlin issues orders for increased aggressiveness and renewed dedication to defeating the enemy. I will continue to file reports that are ignored. I will continue to maintain discipline in my unit while watching the entire structure of German military aviation collapse. But I want it on record in this diary that the outcome of this war was determined not by any failure of courage or determination or skill. It was determined by the simple fact that America can produce more military hardware and more trained pilots than Germany can possibly destroy. This is not a military problem, it's an industrial problem, and it cannot be solved with better tactics.
December 1944 and January 1945 saw the final desperate attempts by the Luftwaffe to maintain air operations. The Battle of the Bulge in December required the Luftwaffe to commit its remaining fighters to close air support for the German ground offensive. The 8th Air Force simply overwhelmed the German fighters. P-51 Mustangs and P-47 Thunderbolts achieved complete air superiority within days. The German ground offensive stalled, in part because it lacked air cover, while the American forces maintained constant close air support throughout. Von Webern participated in these operations. His final combat mission was flown on January 14, 1945, near Cologne. He was flying a Bf-109K-4, the latest variant of the Messerschmitt 109, which represented the absolute peak of what German fighter aircraft design could achieve. The aircraft was as fast as any German fighter could get. The engine was as powerful as German engineers could build. The armament was as formidable as German weapons technology could produce. Against a P-51 Mustang piloted by Captain James Goodson of the American 8th Air Force, none of this mattered. The engagement occurred at 28,000 feet over Cologne. Von Webern had 14 kills to his name. He'd failed to achieve the 25 kills that the Luftwaffe designated as the threshold for ace. He was attempting to intercept a bomber formation when Goodson's flight attacked from above. The tactical situation was hopeless from the start. Von Webern's wingman was shot down in the initial engagement. Von Webern attempted a climbing escape maneuver, but the P-51 simply matched his climb. The American aircraft was faster at altitude, more maneuverable. The P-51 got on von Webern's tail, and von Webern couldn't shake him. His final diary entry, written 2 days after the engagement from his hospital bed, reads, "Engaged P-51 at altitude on January 14th. American pilot was extremely skilled. Superior aircraft performance allowed him to maintain tactical advantage throughout engagement. My aircraft was damaged by cannon fire. Engine caught fire. I attempted to escape at low altitude, but American fighter maintained superior speed and maneuverability at all altitudes. Aircraft was damaged beyond continued flight. I ejected at 2,000 meters. Captured by American ground forces. Currently in hospital with severe burns on left side of body. American medics are professional and competent. Treatment is adequate. From my hospital bed, I can see P-51 Mustangs and P-47 Thunderbolts in the sky. The Germans have perhaps 200 fighters still operational on the Western Front. The Americans have over 3,000 fighters. The numerical situation has only gotten worse since my last combat mission. I have been considering the strategic situation throughout this war. In 1939, when I joined the Luftwaffe, we had superior aircraft and superior pilots. By 1941, after the invasion of Russia, we still had qualitative superiority, though numerical disadvantage was beginning to appear. By 1943, German fighter aircraft were becoming increasingly obsolete compared to Allied designs. By 1944, numerical disadvantage had become so overwhelming that individual skill and tactical brilliance could no longer compensate. The arrival of the P-51 Mustang represented the moment when American industrial capacity overwhelmed German tactical and operational abilities. The aircraft itself is excellent, but its significance is less technical than strategic.
The P-51 Mustang proved that America could build a fighter that could match any German aircraft in performance and maintain an advantage in logistics and production. For every German fighter production facility, there are 10 American facilities. For every German pilot trained, 10 American pilots are trained. For every German aircraft destroyed, 5 American aircraft are built. This is not a problem that courage or skill can solve. This is an industrial problem, and it cannot be solved with tactical brilliance. America did not win the air war because they had better pilots or better tactics. America won the air war because they could produce military equipment and trained personnel at rates that no nation on earth could match. The P-51 Mustang escorting bombers to Berlin was not merely a tactical achievement. It was the physical embodiment of American industrial capacity deployed against German military weakness. I have lost friends. I have seen pilots die who were as good as any German could produce. I have flown until I could barely fly anymore. But I was fighting a war that was already lost before I ever climbed into a cockpit. The diary entries after January 14th are sporadic. Von Webern remained in hospital for 3 weeks, then was transferred to a prisoner of war camp. He survived the war in captivity. After the war ended, he was repatriated to Germany in 1946. In 1962, 17 years after the war ended, Wilhelm von Webern was interviewed by a German military historian researching the Luftwaffe's operations in 1944 and 1945. At this point in his life, von Webern had rebuilt himself as a civilian. He worked as an engineer for a German automobile manufacturer. He had married and started a family. He lived quietly, avoiding attention. But the historian had found his diary, and the historian wanted to understand what von Webern had witnessed and how he had interpreted it. The war was already lost when the P-51 appeared, von Webern told the historian. I don't mean the war was lost in 1944, when the P-51 first showed up in numbers. I mean the war was lost in 1942, when America demonstrated that it could produce military equipment in quantities that exceeded German production by a factor of 3 or 4. The P-51 Mustang was simply the physical manifestation of a decision that America had made years earlier, to convert its entire industrial economy to war production. You fought for Germany anyway, the historian said. Of course, I was a soldier. My duty was to my country and to my men. What else could I do? Refuse to fly? That would have meant a firing squad, or if I was lucky, imprisonment. Besides, even if the strategic situation was hopeless, the tactical situation demanded that we fight. We were defending our homeland against invasion. We were defending German cities against bombing. We had to fight. Did you ever express these opinions to your superiors? The historian asked. Multiple times. I submitted reports detailing the disparity between German and American pilot training. I submitted analysis of American production capacity compared to German production capacity. I made recommendations for tactical changes to account for American fighter superiority. None of it made any difference. Berlin wanted to hear that victory was possible and that we simply needed to demonstrate greater willpower. When I told them the situation was mathematically hopeless, my reports were filed away and ignored. Do you feel your sacrifice was wasted? The historian asked. Not wasted, necessary. Germany had to defend itself. Even if the outcome was inevitable, the defense had to be made. What was wasted was the belief that individual brilliance and courage could overcome industrial disadvantage. That belief cost lives, millions of lives. If Germany had accepted that the war was lost in 1942 or 1943, when that reality became clear, the war could have ended with far fewer casualties. What did the P-51 Mustang represent to you? The historian asked. The P-51 Mustang represented American industrial capacity. It was not merely a fighter aircraft. It was a statement about American power. It said, America has the resources to build a fighter aircraft that can fly from England to Berlin and back while carrying enough fuel to fight enemy aircraft for extended periods of time. America has the industrial capacity to produce this aircraft in quantities that exceed German aircraft production. America has the pilot training infrastructure to replace any losses. America can sustain this level of production indefinitely while simultaneously producing bombers, transports, and every other type of aircraft the war effort requires. That's what the P-51 meant. It meant that Germany could not win because America's productive capacity was simply too large. The historian asked one final question. If you could have done anything differently, what would you have done? Von Webern considered the question carefully. I would have recommended that Germany seek a negotiated peace in 1942, when the situation still offered some hope of acceptable terms. I would have recommended that the government be honest with the people about the strategic situation, rather than offering false hope. I would have recommended that the military leadership accept reality rather than continuing to issue optimistic orders that resulted only in more deaths. But none of these things were possible in a totalitarian regime led by someone who could not admit failure or mistake. The most glaring example was the jet fighter. Germany developed jet aircraft before America. Germany flew the Me-262 in combat before America had any operational jet fighters. But Germany produced fewer than 1,500 Me-262s throughout the entire war. America, which started jet fighter development later, was building jets that would enter service after the war's end. But America was building them in factories designed to produce them by the tens of thousands. This was the fundamental difference. Germany could innovate. Germany could develop impressive technology. What Germany could not do was produce that technology in the quantities necessary to maintain military superiority against an enemy with superior productive capacity. Von Webern's diary also documents something less tangible, but perhaps more important than the tactical realities of combat. It documents the collision between military reality and political ideology. Berlin wanted victory. Berlin was convinced that victory was possible if only the military showed sufficient determination and resolve. Berlin therefore issued orders demanding victory and assuming that if those orders were obeyed with sufficient enthusiasm, victory would be achieved. What Berlin refused to acknowledge was that military determination and political resolve could not overcome the fundamental disparity in productive capacity. You cannot will yourself to produce more aircraft than a nation with greater industrial capacity. You cannot achieve technological superiority through ideological purity. You cannot win a war of attrition against an enemy that has superior resources. Von Webern's diary also documents something less tangible, but perhaps more important than the tactical realities of combat. It documents the collision between military reality and political ideology. Berlin wanted victory. Berlin was convinced that victory was possible if only the military showed sufficient determination and resolve. Berlin therefore issued orders demanding victory and assuming that if those orders were obeyed with sufficient enthusiasm, victory would be achieved. What Berlin refused to acknowledge was that military determination and political resolve could not overcome the fundamental disparity in productive capacity. You cannot will yourself to produce more aircraft than a nation with greater industrial capacity. You cannot achieve technological superiority through ideological purity. You cannot win a war of attrition against an enemy that has superior resources. Von Webern's frustration with Berlin's leadership was not merely tactical, it was philosophical. He was a professional military officer who understood the relationship between resources, strategic objectives, and operational possibilities. Berlin's refusal to acknowledge that relationship frustrated him because it resulted in orders that he knew were impossible to execute and that would result in the unnecessary deaths of his men.
One particularly telling passage in the diary, dated November 1944, reads, "Received commendation from Division Commander for aggressive spirit and dedication to the cause. The commendation notes that pilot losses have reached unsustainable levels, but expresses confidence that increased aggressiveness will overcome this situation. This is not analysis, this is fantasy. You cannot overcome a tenfold disadvantage in numbers through increased aggressiveness. You cannot achieve victory through superior willpower when the enemy has superior resources. The commendation represents the final capitulation of German military leadership to political ideology. We are no longer fighting based on military assessment of the situation. We are fighting based on political requirements that victory be achieved regardless of the strategic reality." This passage encapsulates the fundamental tragedy of the Luftwaffe in 1944 and 1945. The Air Force was being asked to accomplish objectives that were strategically impossible. The leadership was being asked to maintain morale despite the impossibility. And the pilots were being asked to die in support of an objective that was no longer achievable and in some cases had never been achievable. Yet they did die, thousands of them. Because soldiers follow orders, because pilots do not have the privilege of debating the strategic situation with their commanders and refusing to fly if they believe the mission is futile, because the alternative to obedience is often death or imprisonment anyway. This is what makes von Webern's diary so valuable. It captures not just the military realities of the air war, but the human cost of the collision between military reality and political ideology. It captures the perspective of a professional officer who understood the situation clearly and was forced to continue operating within a system that refused to acknowledge his understanding. By January 1945, when von Webern flew his last combat mission, the outcome of the war was entirely clear. The Soviet Union was advancing from the east. The British and Americans were advancing from the west. Germany's industrial base was being systematically destroyed. Germany's military forces were being exhausted, and Germany's leadership was still issuing orders for victory and demanding increased aggressiveness from military units that lacked the resources to be aggressive. The Luftwaffe's final months were a study in organized desperation. The Air Force was flying 3 to 4 times the number of sorties it had flown at the height of its operational capacity, but with 1/10 the combat effectiveness. Pilots were being sent into combat after 40 or 50 hours of training instead of the 200 hours that had been considered minimum for combat readiness just 2 years earlier. Aircraft were being flown until they were falling apart, then being patched up and flown again. Fuel was becoming so scarce that training operations had essentially ceased. By April 1945, just before the final surrender, the Luftwaffe had approximately 100 fighters still operational on the entire German front. The Allies had tens of thousands of fighters available in Europe. The mathematical situation had gone beyond desperation into complete irrelevance. Individual fighter pilots could no longer affect the outcome of the war through their actions. The outcome had been determined by industrial capacity, political decision-making, and military strategy at a level where individual pilots had no influence. This is what the P-51 Mustang represented. It was not merely a fighter aircraft. It was the visible manifestation of a war that Germany could not win because Germany could not match the productive capacity of its enemies. Every P-51 that appeared over German airspace was a reminder that America could build thousands more. Every escort mission deep into German territory was a reminder that America had the resources to sustain this level of operations indefinitely. Every successful fighter sweep by American pilots was a reminder that American pilots had received better training, had more combat experience, and were flying aircraft that were at least equal in performance to German aircraft. The Luftwaffe was not defeated by any single weapon or tactic. It was defeated by the collective weight of American industrial capacity, applied consistently over years in every theater of the war, through every type of weapon system from fighters to bombers to transport aircraft to rockets to radar systems. Wilhelm von Webern's diary stands as one of the most important primary sources for understanding the air war in Europe during World War II. Unlike official reports, which often minimize problems and maximize achievements, von Webern's diary captures the unvarnished reality of a professional military officer watching his Air Force collapse under the weight of superior American resources. The diary's central thesis, that the air war was decided by industrial capacity rather than military skill, has been confirmed by every serious historical analysis since the war's end. The Luftwaffe was not defeated because German pilots lacked courage. German pilots showed exceptional courage right up to the end of the war. The Luftwaffe was not defeated because German aircraft were inferior in design. German aircraft were generally comparable in performance to Allied aircraft, and in some cases, superior. The Luftwaffe was defeated because Germany could not replace its losses, while America could. This has profound implications for understanding not just World War II, but modern military strategy in general. Military power is ultimately derivative of industrial power. Tactical excellence and individual heroism are meaningful within a given strategic context, but they cannot overcome a fundamental disparity in productive capacity. A nation that can produce 10,000 tanks will defeat a nation that can produce 1,000 tanks, regardless of how superior the latter's tanks might be in individual combat. A nation that can train 10,000 pilots will defeat a nation that can train 1,000 pilots, regardless of how superior the latter's pilots might be in individual engagements. Von Webern understood this principle. He tried to communicate it to his superiors. His superiors refused to accept it, and Germany paid the price for that refusal in millions of dead soldiers and millions of dead civilians.